Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jessica Rockhold, and I'm the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us tonight. I want to take a moment and thank the Jewish Studies program at the University of Kansas for hosting us, for making it possible to be in this lovely auditorium, and really importantly, for our rather large online audience, making it possible to offer this both in person and remotely. So we're very grateful for that and the continued partnership and support of our mission. I'd like to particularly mention Tyra Coleman from Jewish Studies, who has been the person that thought of everything before we could even ask for it. She's one of those people that gets things done. So thank you, Tyra. We gather today to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's a date designated by the United Nations General Assembly in 2005 as an International Day of Remembrance and Education. It's meant to honor the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of non-Jews who were victims of the Nazis. It's a date chosen because of the international symbolism of Auschwitz. Auschwitz was a camp that housed an international prisoner population. It was a camp specifically at Auschwitz-Birkenau that came to represent the pinnacle of Nazi innovation in creating a modern killing apparatus. It's a camp that was captured largely intact, and in so doing, the camp itself became a witness. And it's a camp which was liberated 80 years ago today. As is our tradition, tonight we focus on the mandate within that UN declaration to educate. Before we do that, though, I invite you to reflect on this liberation, this 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and the ones that would follow through the spring of 1945, and the impact that that had on the victims who had fled Europe as refugees, who 80 years ago this spring were first able to begin to receive the news of the fates of their loved ones who had not been able to escape, of those who were hiding or passing as non-Jews, who made their way back into society 80 years ago and attempted to return home, often to find it occupied and their return unwelcomed by their former neighbors. And those who survived the ghettos and the camps, who, again, 80 years ago, began their long quest to regain their health and to rebuild their shattered lives. I want to take a moment to thank, I know we have a few of them with us online, to thank our survivor community for their legacy of testimony and the lessons that they have provided for each of us, and just ask you to keep them in your mind tonight as we learn this history. Tonight, we focus on the liberation of Auschwitz. It, again, is this international symbol of the Holocaust, yet it's unique in so many ways among those other camps. Unlike the stories that are so familiar to us as Americans of the liberation of places like Dachau and Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, this is a space that had an Eastern experience of liberation, which occurred in the context of an active and moving front. It is a liberation of the space and the mechanisms of the final solution, but predominantly not of the people who witnessed it and survived to share their stories. And it's a history that, despite a remarkable documentation record, would remain partially shrouded, in some cases largely shrouded, until the fall of the Iron Curtain. Here to share with us that history and lead us through this journey tonight is MCHE's historian and Director of Education, Dr. Shelly Cline. I know many of you in the room know Shelly's work well. She's a remarkable historian, but as all good educators are, she's a gifted storyteller. Shelly?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you all for being with us this evening as we remember this history. When we think about the liberation of Auschwitz, and as Jessica invited us to think about liberation in general across this spring that follows, so often when we think about liberation, it has such a positive connotation because it should. And yet, as we also know, if you've listened to survivors speak, there is a moment of euphoria that's then followed by deep sadness and complication. because the lives that they were wanting to return to, they realized at this moment of liberation are over. And the family members they hope to get back to are most likely dead. And so that makes liberation a complicated moment. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to start with this image here. Because again, we often think about happy euphoria. And while that's present, there's also so much sadness and trauma to deal with as well. I'll talk a little bit more about the artist who drew this image, but this was one of the Soviet liberators who sketched this upon his entry into the camp. Additionally, as we move through tonight, I'd like us to think about what it means to remember. What does it mean to commemorate or memorialize, and how we all take a very active role in that. Before we talk about liberation of Auschwitz specifically, I think it's important to look at the geography and think about how much of Europe had been conquered by Nazi forces. This map shows the gains that they had made. This is up till 1942. As many of you who study World War II might know, 1943 represents kind of a turning point. And so really these demarcation lines in terms of the Soviet or the German advance into Soviet territory, that's where it will end. So if you look at this map of Europe, this would be daunting for people, around the world, right? Especially those living in Europe, to see this much Nazi territory under control. So that means that when we're looking at that tide of war turning, it's a vast amount of space that needs to, in fact, be liberated from Nazi-controlled Europe. Just a little timeline of what liberation looks like. In January, Auschwitz will be liberated. Prior to the Soviets getting to Auschwitz, they had already liberated Majdanek, and they had come to the spaces of what had been Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. Those camps had been dismantled, so once the Soviets came to those locations, there were no survivors, there were no belongings. There was just what had been the space where these killing facilities had happened. And you can see that's what the photo shows here. That empty field, that was what Belzec, the killing center of Belzec, looked like. So the Nazis, once they were done with these spaces in 1943, plowed them under. So the Soviets come into those spaces and they don't find much, right? As Jessica mentioned, the process of liberation in the East and West is very different. That in the East is happening in the context of active war, and it is the Soviets that do reach the primary killing facilities. They find some intact things in Majdanek, they find them in Auschwitz as well. But unlike the American and British experience of liberation, we don't get to any of the primary killing facilities. So that's very different. Consequently, when the Soviets are encountering these spaces that they liberate, they're not encountering vast numbers of people. We'll look at the survivor numbers of Auschwitz, but they're really quite small compared to what the Americans or British will find in, say, Dachau or Bergen-Belsen. Tens of thousands of people in those camps versus about 7,000 to 9,000 happening in Auschwitz. We'll also see that within the context of Soviet liberation, there is far less institutional support provided to survivors compared to that experience in the West. Some of this is institutional differences, and some of it really comes down to where in the war this is happening, right? So when the Americans are doing their liberating, it's at the very end of the war. The Soviets is a little bit earlier, so there's still a lot of territory to gain. So ahead of the liberation of Auschwitz, as the Red Army makes advances towards the West, it's clear to many people in the Nazi authorities that some evacuations will have to happen from these spaces. And so as the Red Army approaches, they begin evacuations beginning in the fall and then sort of speeding up as we get into the winter. Now, while they are moving large numbers of prisoners out of this Auschwitz space, there is a lot of sort of internal memos going back and forth between the people in charge of Auschwitz and the subcamps to not do anything that will dismantle the infrastructure so that it can't be returned to. So for example, some of the facilities and infrastructure that go along with the farms and some of the other factory work that's associated with the camp complex, they won't dismantle those because they're hoping that maybe this is just a temporary setback and they'll be able to eventually come back to these spaces. Over this time, the SS will march out about 56,000 prisoners from the Auschwitz camps into the West. So if you know about death marches that happened, the destination of these is often these Western camps in the interior of Germany. That's why places like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and Buchenwald have such high populations at the end of the war. They're receiving those large numbers of Auschwitz prisoners that are death marched into the interior of Germany. In the final days of Auschwitz, we'll see that there's about, they march out about 56,000. There's about 9,000 that are remaining in these final days. And then prior to them actually leaving, they will kill almost 1,000 others. Some survivors will, well, now survivors, some prisoners will use this as a moment to escape because there is a good amount of chaos that's happening. As you can see in this painting done by a survivor, the SS were desperate to get rid of documents and records at this moment in the camp's history. So they start burning prisoner files. They try and get rid of the photographs that were taken, especially in Auschwitz I, on the early days of the camp when people were photographed for identification purposes. They try and get rid of those. And actually, a large number of the photographs that are still in the Auschwitz archive today were saved because there were prisoners who kind of defied these orders. They looked like they were going to burn them and then put out the fire, save them, and then nailed the door shut on the room where they were held. And they were betting on the fact that the SS were in such a hurry to get out that they wouldn't take the time to pry that door open. And they were right. So a lot of the records that we have left from Auschwitz were either saved by prisoners or the SS certainly ran out of time to destroy them. So in these final days, there is a lot of chaos. By January 20th or 21st, most of the guard towers have been abandoned. And so there's just kind of sporadic SS patrols that are happening. So again, this makes it very dangerous for prisoners who are maybe thinking about escaping or trying to escape, because it is, as with much of the Holocaust experience, a lot of luck, right? If you happen to escape when the roaming guard unit is not there, you would have some luck, but it was pretty unpredictable. The Wehrmacht will also come through, so the retreating German army comes through this space as well, and they will specifically plunder some of the Canada warehouses and take some of the belongings that have been collected there from prisoners. In those few days before the evacuation, we also see the crematoriums blown up. The Crema 4 was damaged in the the Sonderkommando revolt in the fall of 44. It's dismantled shortly after that. And then Cremas 2 and 3 had a lot of their equipment dismantled, and the Germans were planning and began to ship that equipment into the interior of Germany to other concentration camps. So they will eventually blow those up on January 20th, and they keep Crema 5 in operation. So the crematorium is still working and burning bodies throughout this period. The gas chambers, no one has been gassed in Auschwitz since November, but they didn't dismantle the equipment. So theoretically, they could have if they had chosen to. But as you can see, they will eventually blow up Crema 5 the day before they leave on January 26th. So that means that today, if you have visited Auschwitz, there are no standing gas chambers in Auschwitz today because they were destroyed by the retreating Germans. Another thing they do, they set fire to the Canada warehouses. So again, we'll look more specifically, but I'm sure you can envision them already. These are the places that held the belongings that were taken from people who arrived there. So the vast number of shoes and clothing and things like that were held in these warehouses. And so again, in this effort to get rid of evidence, they set fire to that which they could not transport out. The middle photo shows a rail car that's filled with some of these belongings. So again, these final days, they're trying to ship out as much of the stuff as they can. And in the end, when they can't ship it out, they decide to just set it on fire. I mention this because, as we know, the Soviets found a tremendous amount of stuff, even though the Nazis set fire to so much of it. And the picture on the very edge, so I showed you a picture of Canada with the women in it there. That's of it when it's functioning as they're sorting the goods. And then in the far picture shows the burning, the remains of the Canada warehouses after they have been burned. So these are the preparations that were made by the SS as the final measures that they take before they leave the camp. And this is the Soviet army that they're fleeing. So here you can see this is the Soviet troops moving into Krakow on January 18th, 1945. And I've given you a nice map there showing this kind of the Soviet advances. And I know that it's small. It's probably small for you. Is it small for me too? But if you look, you can see you can find Krakow there in the bottom kind of middle. They will get to Krakow on the 18th. But as we know, they don't make it to Auschwitz until January 27th. So there's quite a few days that they stay in Krakow that before they can kind of advance the front as far over to Auschwitz, even though it's really, if you were to drive it today, it's about a 2-hour drive. So it isn't a huge distance. There's also certainly rivers to cross and bridges were out. So there's lots of actual impediments to their moving that direction. And they didn't have anything, this first Ukrainian division that was headed towards Auschwitz, they didn't have anything specifically in their orders to like go find this camp where lots of people are being held, right? So there was knowledge of Auschwitz. Certainly it wasn't, secret to the Soviet higher ups, but this particular Ukrainian troop was noted there are barracks here, right? There are some factories here, but it wasn't a priority for them to hustle over and do the liberation, which also means that by the time they got there, they were quite surprised, especially the regular enlisted man at what they saw. And this is what they find. So it is members of the 60th Army, which is part of the First Ukrainian Front. They get to Auschwitz, but before they get to Birkenau, they first get to Bunamonovitz, which we often know as Auschwitz III. It had the IG Farben factory, so they liberate that first. Then they go through the town of Ochetsum, and then they do Auschwitz I, and then eventually they get to Birkenau. The process of taking these main 3 camps and the town, they lose about 230 soldiers in the process. Most of the fighting, the heaviest fighting, was around Birkenau itself. And they will also discover once the Soviets are in the camp, they discover about 600 people who have been recently killed. There were not camera crews with the Soviet divisions on that first day. So what we have instead to capture some of those initial reactions come from the same Soviet Jewish soldier who sketched the beginning slide that I showed you. And I think if you look at these images, right, this really shows you the despair that he encountered. And this is a man who had previously been in Majdanek. So he was with the troops that had liberated Majdanek. He had made sketches of what he saw there. He'd actually done an exhibition earlier in the summer of his drawings to show, recount that. These images, now I'll show you another slide that are very much a contrast to this. But this is far from the typical Soviet view of liberation that we see, and images that I'll show you here in a minute. These look more in keeping with this sort of liberation Soviet style. And he has labeled these the savior and the liberators have arrived. So it's very different when you can see, it's very probable that these are the type of images he was assuming would go into an exhibition that the Soviets would support, whereas these were things that he felt he had to draw to capture because he was so compelled and moved by what he saw. But there's a very different tone, right, to these 2 sets of drawings. Camera crews will arrive the next day. So even though they're not present on the 27th, they arrive the 28th and they begin filming. They film for a while, and early February, they will make a request to Moscow that they need more equipment. They need more cameramen, and they need a portable light source because it's really difficult to film inside the barracks with the type of camera that they had. They also don't have the early footage that they took, you couldn't sync sound and images. So they weren't able to record survivors talking while they were being filmed. So in March, they will make another request, this time for the ability to sync sound and image. And that request is denied. They are told by Moscow that another unit nearby is using that equipment and they're not a top priority. So it's kind of an interesting contrast if you look at kind of the low priority that documenting Auschwitz was at this particular moment for the Soviets versus what it's like in the West. As many of you have probably seen the newsreel and film footage of liberation that happened, again, at Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and Buchenwald, there was a lot of cameramen that were there. The Signal Corps was on site for that, and then they will also enlist famous directors filmmakers of the time, John Ford, Alfred Hitchcock, to begin putting together films that show what liberation was like. So it's kind of a different sense of priorities between East and West. This image that you see here, this is one of those early images that is taken by the film crew when they arrive early January. I say this because you'll see, I'm going to show you some of the footage that they capture, but it's difficult in some ways for consistency's sake to tell exactly when these snippets were taken, because they will film in January, they film in February, and they're even filming still in March. And at the time, they kind of edit everything together. So in the 80s, there was a filmmaker team from Berlin who tried to kind of repiece this liberation footage together. And one of the things that they were able to do is use the weather from those weeks in Poland. It's really snowy on January 27th. It is less so in February and March. So in even these clips that I'll show you here in a second, you'll see in one shot, there's snow everywhere. In the very next shot, there's no snow and there might even be leaves on the trees. So that's what accounts for it, because then when they were doing the original editing, they didn't care so much for the consistency there. So this is just a brief clip and it will show this. One of the cameramen who was doing the shooting talks about what this process was like for him. Now, this interview was conducted in the 1980s and it was done by this German filmmaker team who they put in a request in the 80s to find all of the film, like the extra film footage of this Auschwitz liberation. It's a long process. They finally get a hold of it. And in doing so, they come across this cameraman. And so this is what he has to say about the process.
Я до того, как туда вступил на территорию Освенцима, немного слыхал.
Before I entered the Auschwitz camp area, I had already heard some things about
То,
it.
что я увидел там,
But what I saw and filmed there was the most horrible thing I ever saw or filmed during the
это
Great
самое
Patriotic War.
страшное, что я видел и снимал во время Отечественной войны. У проволочной ограды стояли сотни людей и смотрели на нас.
By the barbed wire fence stood hundreds of people. They looked at our soldiers with fear in their eyes because they didn't know that these were Soviet soldiers, liberators, and so they were expecting the worst,
Поэтому
death.
ожидали тоже плохого, ожидали смерти. Мы снимали лица этих.
So I think that's a nice encapsulation of, he'd heard of it, right? Because he had arrived there right afterwards. And yet this is someone who had been through a lot of the war already. And yet this was the most terrible thing that he comes to witness. Also, I think it's important that he notes that the people they encounter are a little afraid of the soldiers, which stands to reason, right? Uniformed people in the past have not been good for them. But again, kind of in contrast with some of these images that show the survivors kind of swarming the troops in this heroic, gratitude. That maybe came at a moment later, but there was certainly some fear and distrust to begin with. So because there were not cameras on site that first day, sometime around the end of February, early March, the camera crews, probably with direction from Moscow, decide to recreate the liberation of Auschwitz. And so this short clip follows what they reimagined liberation to look like. You'll notice that it takes place on a Birkenau, but back at the main camp at Auschwitz I. You'll note the propaganda style, and you'll also note the health of the prisoners. And there is no sound on this. There are 3 different camera angles that were used for this. You can see most of them are not wearing striped uniforms. Most of them are quite healthy. So this would have been filmed many weeks after liberation, and many of the people who agreed to participate in it were Polish workers who worked in the Bunamovitz camp. So they wouldn't have had the same terrible conditions as those in Birkenau. And as you can imagine, since this does seem like a film of the 40s, they had a few takes, right? This is something that was like take one, take two, try it again. So definitely there were many. This was shot a number of times. When they shot that footage, which wasn't that widely used, because even people who reviewed it at the time thought this doesn't seem to fit with everything that we've been saying. So that particular footage wasn't in itself used that often, especially as the film footage. Now, stills from that were used. So you'll still see, if you Google liberation footage of or pictures of Auschwitz, you will see stills from this particular film, even though as a newsreel, it wasn't heavily used. Within the same time period that they do this sort of fake liberation, they're also doing a lot of other filming as well. And in this section, which will probably seem very familiar to you, they will film some of the children. This was distributed to other countries, and the hope was to have it be more widely viewed. And parts of this were then incorporated into the film that was shown at what becomes the Auschwitz Memorial.
Among the 2,819 liberated Auschwitz inmates, there were 180 children. 52 of them were under 8 years of age. How could they survive this hell? They managed to survive because they were wanted for medical research instead of mice and rabbits. But the German murderers with medical degrees were only keen on a particular kind of children. They wanted to experiment on twins. Twins were the special research material of Dr. Mengele and Dr. Schmitz. Children who did not belong to that category were simply murdered. The infants were known by the numbers on their little hands.
So again, you've probably seen this footage before. These are kids that wouldn't have been wearing those uniforms. They were given these uniforms later. They're adult uniforms. There's kind of a discrepancy on whether it was just, they don't have uniforms, let's put them in there because they need to be identified as prisoners. Other researchers think that they were put in the uniforms to highlight that they're kids because the uniforms are too big. But either way, the fact that they're wearing them is very much a construction and not reflective of the exact functioning of the camp. This too constitutes scenes that they had to do and redo. So these kids would have walked through the double fence again, back and forth, that sort of thing. So this filming is going on throughout these early weeks of liberation. In addition, of course, now we have to, the Soviets, as they come across these people, they have to help, right? So what do you do with the approximately 7,000 people that are left in these spaces? And so they begin to give what kind of, medical care that they can. They will have to enlist medical assistance from nearby cities, especially Krakow. Initially, they will treat survivors in the main camp, in Birkenau, and in Bunamovitz. They're treating them in these 3 locations rather than centralizing them in one camp. At the end of February, beginning of March, they start to move everyone into the main camp because it just makes it easier for personnel. If they were physically able to leave, prisoners did so, right? They wanted to get out of there, try and get home, try and find relatives that maybe would have survived. Beginning at the end of February into March, they will then start moving people into the main camp because it's easier to handle them there in terms of minister to the sick. So here you see these horse-drawn carriages are removing people from Birkenau to move them into the main camp of Auschwitz. And all these images were taken by the same film crew that we've been following. There are some challenges. We hear about this in the West as well, challenges to medical care. A big one was that a lot of these survivors were afraid of doctors. They were afraid of syringes. They were afraid of what was in the food. They didn't want to take a shower. So there was a lot of actual complications to getting them the treatment that they needed. They also, as doctors and nurses, struggled with survivors breaking habits they'd learned in the camp, such as hoarding food under their mattresses, or when they saw, a soup tureen come out, that they would swarm it. So it was really difficult for them to, as you can understand, it's understandable, to convince people that no, there is enough food. You can have what you need. There was also significant language barriers, right? So as Jessica mentioned, this was a camp that had a very European international population. And for the most part, a lot of the doctors and nurses were Polish. So there would be kind of a difficulty of translation when you're talking about people from Greece and France and whatnot. So that was an issue. There was also a lack of running water for quite a while. The water systems were out, so they had to either get water by going to the river or use melted snow. And there was also a lack of laundry facilities. So eventually they'll build a new laundry in Auschwitz I that can help with this, because part of the problem was that people, there was disease from lice and whatnot, and there wasn't a good way to clean that clothing, nor did they have enough new clothes to give to people. So things started to improve once the laundry was built, and also once they started getting shipments of underwear in. Here are two photos of nurses that were assisting in this process. As you can see in the one photo, they're wearing striped uniforms. You might think, oh, these are former prisoners. No, those are nurses. There was a lack of material for like medical uniforms, and so they used prisoner uniforms. Eventually, the Soviet authorities are going to want to shut down Auschwitz I as a hospital and use it as a transit camp for German POWs. So they will remove the prisoners who are the former prisoners who are convalescing, and they'll move them kind of outside the fenced area. And eventually that will close down by the fall, which is pretty fast if you think about how long the displaced persons camps were open in the Western sector. For them to close like aid and hospital facilities by October of 45 is a really short time to be helping. They also have to deal with the burial of corpses. Now, again, 600 is not a small number. At the same time, when the British come into Bergen-Belsen, they find 13,000 unburied bodies. So the numbers of dead to deal with in these Western camps is really astronomical in general, but certainly, the 600 that they deal with is difficult. But they will talk about, you can see these photos, they're using coffins to bury the dead. And you can even see, if you look closely, this is a funeral procession there. And symbolically, they have all of the coffins were carried on the shoulders of people, except for one child's coffin, which was drawn in this hearse. And they take these, the dead from Birkenau, and they will take them over to a burial site near Auschwitz I. And you can see that's what this looks like. If you're familiar with the pictures from Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, you probably think of literally piles and piles of bodies, mass graves. This too is a mass grave, but people are in coffins. So really, this image is, I think, very representative of that difference between the East and West divide and what the liberators found. As we'll see in a second, these Soviet liberators found a tremendous amount of stuff and very few people. The opposite is true of the Western liberators. They found a lot of people who were dying and had died, and not their belongings, right? And there was a religious ceremony carried out to oversee this burial that was overseen by priests. So again, while all these things are kind of happening at once, we began the investigation of the crime. And so I'm going to read you this title. This is the committee that is doing the investigating, and they are known as the Extraordinary State Commission for the Establishment and Investigation of the Atrocities of the German Fascist Invaders and Their Accomplices and the Damage They Caused to Citizens, Collective Farms, Public Organizations, State Enterprises, and Institutions of the Soviet Union. Henceforth, we will call them the Extraordinary Commission. So this is a committee that, and this photo is taken in Rudolf Hess's his former office there in Auschwitz. This committee has been operating since 1942. And so pretty much as soon as that war starts to shift and the Soviets start to gain a little territory, they begin investigating German crimes. It's this committee that will investigate some of those Einsatzgruppen sites where mass killings took place. They will go and try and figure out how many people, now they're not going to get to all of them, but they are working to tell how many people have been killed in these sites. Partially, this is because they want to document this so that the Germans can be punished, and partially they're doing it for reparation purposes. This has an interesting tie back with the First World War. So when the First World War happened, the Soviet Union did not get reparations. And they were not happy about that, right? They felt like they were due a piece of the pot, like these other victorious nations. And so once it came to this go around, they make very thorough documentation of what this damage that had been done to Soviet property, to Soviet people, that they're counting as Soviet people, because they're hoping to kind of tally it up in some sort of, reparations that'll be coming their way later, which of course does not happen. It's a pretty large endeavor, as you can imagine, and I would hope from that title. There's about 7 million Soviet citizens that are involved in giving information to this. So they will go around, they'll be interviewed by, the committee travels the countryside and interviews citizens. In some cases, the citizens are unclear who did what to them, right? Because there's a lot of back and forth, and there are Germans burning farms and there are Soviets burning farms. Though I'm guessing that when the Soviets show up, you are sure going to say that it was the Germans that burned you out and not the Soviets. And they will also use a lot of this documentation. The Soviets will submit this eventually to Nuremberg as well. So we will use some of their documentation. This is just another quick video to show you some of the evidence that they take. And you can see here, there's also no sound, but this again shows you kind of that mismatch of when filming was done. So this is early film. This probably was like a January 27th, 29th, or 28th, 29th. There's snow. Now they're going to show the fences, kind of the apparatus and structure of the camp, but now we've jumped in time. There's no snow. This is the remains of the crematoriums. That would have been used for punishment. So there's lots of these lots of snippets like this that are used for this documentation. They also want to show, same camera crew is going to take still photos, and here we have them at the remains of the cremas, but they often will capture members of the committee there on site. So it was not just to document in terms of here's the evidence, but they're also documenting the evidence being collected. More of the what's left of the cremas. Some of these were being prepared again for shipment. Then we have the commission inside some of the barracks. And then they also document the belongings. So this is where we get a lot of that famous footage of suitcases and shoes, because one, they're documenting, this does highlight the absence of the people. But if you're thinking about the purposes of this committee, it's to highlight, look what the Germans took. Right? So this is all essentially should be tallied up in what we're owed, because they're going to count this sort of in their purview. But we have the prosthetic limbs, the eyeglasses, the sacks of hair, all these things that the Soviets, film and capture at this moment of liberation, they form the basis of the museum's collection. So if you have been to the, museum at any point, you have probably seen these items, and they're the same ones that the Soviets found. They will also, the committee will document the dead. So they'll conduct autopsies on about 500 bodies that they find. Mostly they conclude that these people died of malnutrition and starvation. They will document the living. They will do interviews and examinations of nearly 3,000 survivors to document, in some cases, medical experiments that were done on them, and in other cases, just what the camp has done to them. So you see this is a frostbitten foot. The center image is of a man who has bayonet scars from being bayoneted. And then we have a man who is near death from starvation. So these are all things that they wanted to, again, put in their report, and they will form some of the basis of the museum. In the early days and until relatively recently, some of these photos, especially those photos taken of people who had undergone medical experiments, would have been shown, in some cases blown up in kind of large prints as a part of the museum's display. They've since removed those, which is, of course, an excellent move because these people did not consent to the experiments that were done on them. They didn't consent to the photos that were taken of them subsequently, and they certainly didn't consent to them being blown up and then put on display in the museum. So there's it's important that we have them for documentation, but always good to think about how and why we're using images like this. So in the midst of all this work of the Extraordinary Committee, we have Western liberation. So they're doing their work, especially a lot of it's being done in March. As we move into April, that is the major time of liberations in the West. So this map just gives you a sense of, you can see the Americans and British coming across, and the list of camps that they will liberate. Again, this is done in the course of the end of the war. So it's still, the war isn't over, but it's closer to being over than it was in January. This is a place where they find lots of people and lots of people who've recently died, but they find relatively few belongings. And there's a really high level of documentation and one that's made immediately available to the public. So the Soviets are taking this film footage, and some of it, there's some documentation that is immediately released, so that we do in the American press get, releases about Auschwitz, but a lot of the images they hold on to, and they only make available at the end of the war. On the West side of things, we make those available right away, right? They're in newspapers, they're in newsreels. This is something that is immediately being consumed by the Western media and the Western audience. On May 7th, the day that there's a whole thing whether how the war ends on the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th. But when the official ceasefire happens on the 7th, this is when the Extraordinary Committee Commission, they publish their findings. So if you think about that, as of May 7th, they have concluded, we've now learned everything there is to know about Auschwitz, right? Obviously there's so much more, but they will release their findings on May 7th. And that's also when they start to release some of this film footage that they have. And then they will put together an 18-minute film of the stuff that they've collected over the last months. And they will have a screening in Moscow at the end of May to highlight some of that. Some of their major findings that are unfortunate, they only list victims by the country they were deported from. And so they don't state nationality, ethnicity, or that the vast majority of the victims of Auschwitz were Jewish. So that doesn't make it into the report. And they miscalculate the death toll. So they base it on some survivor testimony and also on the capacity, the ideal capacity of the gas chamber crematoriums. Go now. My screen has gone off, but I can see it there. So I'll just look here. Oh, it's back. We're good. So they miscalculate. Instead of having what we know, the 1.2 million victims, they set that number at 4 million. And that is the number that they will stick with really until the 1990s. So that's kind of again, a misinformation that is, or miscalculation. Then the Soviets will reuse the space. So I already mentioned they were reusing Auschwitz I as a transit camp. They will then go ahead and use Birkenau as a camp for German POWs as well. And you can see this is what the space looked like in May, shortly after it had been closed down as a former camp for German POWs. Auschwitz I, again, so this is what it kind of looked like as they were using it as this transit camp for POWs. This is the main gate. And as you look at it, you probably note it's missing something kind of significant. That would be the famous Arbeit macht frei sign. So once it was no longer a working POW camp, they transition it. Almost immediately after that's done, people start to visit it. It becomes a site, even though it's not officially a museum yet, people are visiting it as though it is a memorial. And in the process of this, the Soviet authorities take down the Arbeit macht frei sign and are preparing to have it shipped into the Soviet Union. And there was a Polish man who served on a similar, so there was both the Soviet Committee for Extraordinary Crimes, and then there was a Polish one. The Polish one was obviously far smaller. And one of the members of this Polish committee had access to the site. And so he sees that the sign has been taken down, it's being loaded on a wagon, and he bribes the Russian guy guarding it and gets the sign back. And so it's then kind of put in storage. And so it can eventually be restored once it becomes a museum. But it's kind of a last minute save by this man who felt like that was something that really belonged in this space. The museum will open in 1947, but people start visiting it in 1946. This is the gate. This isn't the Arbeit-Macht-Frei gate. This is when they make it into a museum, they move the entrance point to over where the crematorium gas chamber was in Auschwitz I. So that's kind of the reorientation. Many of the employees of this first museum are survivors themselves, so they will have a large say in the shape of this memorial. And here's a memorial that's put up in Birkenau specifically to the Jewish people who've been killed there. I mention that because eventually that memorial will be taken down and they will put up in the color photo. This is the International Memorial that they established in 1967, and it is dedicated to victims of fascism. So again, that specific Jewishness of the space will be kind of temporarily erased while it's still under the Soviet sphere of control. First exhibit happens in 47, very much dictated by survivors, and you can see while what you visit today looks a little different, it still keeps some of that original form of what the survivors envisioned. There's also tours that start immediately. People who want to, in many cases, these are people who had some sort of connection to the space. But I mention this because often we have mixed feelings, as we should, about anything resembling Holocaust tourism. And I think it's really important to realize in a space like Auschwitz, visitors have literally been a part of that space since the camp closed. The 1950 exhibit, again, now that Poland is under the Soviet sphere of influence, they direct the museum to be very pro-communist and anti-capitalist. So you will see some displays that are kind of equating Nazism and American democracy. That will go away in the 1955 redesign after Stalin's death. But they're still using the 4 million number here. The archive starts, and again, as Jessica pointed out, some of these documents that the Soviets collected during their initial investigation, once they're done, they take those documents back to Moscow, and there they stay until after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so in the 1990s, you start to see kind of a flood of documentation coming into the museum to bolster their archive. There's some early preservation things that happen. You can see the roof of the sauna. This is where people were processed into the camp. That had fallen in the early 60s, so they redo that roof in 1965. And then today, there's still a lot of preservation efforts underway. And I think that's something that when you visit a place like this, it's very easy to look at the ruins of the crematorium and think, oh, well, those are just ruins. But they're in a real state of like arrested decay, right? So there has to be a lot of effort to make sure that the groundwater doesn't like seep in and further deteriorate them. You can see some preservation efforts there with some of the few remaining wooden barracks where they've been dismantled and put back together so that they can be more stabilized. A lot of those wooden barracks were immediately, once it was no longer POW camp of any sort, people from neighboring towns came and got the buildings and the materials because after the war there was a shortage of these sort of things. And so you just sort of, before it was that space was officially protected, some of those things went away. So the few barracks that are left there, a tremendous amount of effort goes into protecting them. It's interesting, too, to think about those initial efforts of the cameramen that began at the end of January and continued through February and March. And even though they didn't have maybe they didn't get as widely distributed as they maybe thought, a lot of this film footage then formed the basis of what would be the visitor experience to the Auschwitz Museum and Memorial. So if you visited the memorial anytime from the 60s until 1990, you would see basically the Soviet film that was played there to welcome you to the space, and it also gave you that version of Soviet liberation and Soviet history. As of 1990, they replaced it with a different film, and in 2020, still another film replaced it. And now that film really highlights the experience of it isn't about liberation, it's really about the people who were sent there. And I think the most impactful statement that it makes, the new film, is that you, the visitor in Auschwitz, you will spend more time there that day than the majority of the people who were sent there. because most people who were sent to Auschwitz were killed quite quickly, right? So I think it's a really powerful thing to start your visit to think how short of time people had there and how efficient that killing process was. And lastly, this was a quote given by an Auschwitz survivor at the 75th anniversary in 2020. And in terms of thinking about the memory of the Holocaust and why it's so important, in addition to honoring survivors and victims, this is a important warning from the survivor. He says, "Auschwitz did not fall suddenly from the skies. It was all tiny steps approaching until what happened here behind me did happen. Do not be indifferent when any power or government infringes on existing social rights. Otherwise, you won't even notice when you and your heirs suddenly see an Auschwitz falling down from the sky straight upon them." And I can take any questions you might have. Yes.
Poland. Notice that the Polish government now has done a pretty good job of maintaining sites, of interpreting what goes on there. What has driven the Polish government to do?
Yeah, so the question, if you didn't hear it, and for those online, is the Polish government has done a good job maintaining the site and other Holocaust sites, and what motivates them to do that? I mean, a short answer is that the site of Auschwitz is important to Poland as a country, because the very first people sent to Auschwitz I were Poles. And so, as we know, there is a very significant Jewish history to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz I specifically has a very Polish history as well. So in some ways, it's not self-interested, but they very much see it as an important part of their national history. And so it is. Poland does a good job of preserving it. Additionally, Germany pays a lot of money into the memorial as well. And there's also lots of other international funding that goes to preserving specifically the site of Auschwitz as well. But it is, if you've been there, it's a tremendous site, right? There's a lot of acres. There's a lot of, if you think about every one of those artifacts that you're seeing, whether it be a shoe or an eyeglass or a suitcase, all of those things require very specific preservation. They have an incredible preservation lab there that it can deal with all the various materials that these artifacts are made of. So it's really impressive to see the number of people who have dedicated their lives to preserving this space and these artifacts. Yes, Jessica. Yeah, well, how is it being told today is a big one. As many of you probably know, in recent years, there has been a kind of a resurgence of the glorification of the victory in World War II. However, as much as the current Russian government likes to extol the victory in the Great Patriotic War, the Holocaust portion of it always really takes a back seat. They weren't particularly interested in these camps when they came across them, and it isn't something that they necessarily highlight in their history today. Even when it comes to something like looking at the revolt at Sobibor, that was headed by a Russian man. So it's that even that doesn't take a direct place in their history. So no, they did not get their reparations because we did not go after Germany in the same way that we did after the First World War. Though they did get a big chunk of Germany, so I suppose maybe that's how they took it out. Yes?
Do you think it's appropriate to guess who among the people here lost family in the Holocaust?
Yes, if you've lost family in the Holocaust and are comfortable sharing, you can share. Thank you. Anything else? All right, well, thank you so much for attending. Thank you for remembering, and we hope to see you again in the future.